You're back with The Nation. When our next guest left the UK to take up a new job in Australia, then Conservative MP David Cameron remarked the sooner he gets on the ship, the better. Economist Dr Oliver Hartwich has critics and fans who've closely watched his work at Britain's leading think tank, the Policy Exchange, and more recently at the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney. He's now in New Zealand to head up the New Zealand Initiative, a merger of the Business Roundtable and the New Zealand Institute. And after his first week on the job, he joins us now in studio. Welcome to the programme, Dr Hartwich.
Good morning. That's
quite an interesting merger, two very different beasts. Why do you think they've brought you in? Is it because, for example, you may have a blank slate when it comes to New Zealand?
I think they were looking for someone with a sense of humour, so they couldn't get past the German, of course. But no, seriously, the organisation, I mean, it's built on the legacy of two existing organisations, the old Business Roundtable and the New Zealand Institute. But the idea was really to form a new initiative, and that's why it's called the New Zealand Initiative, and it's built to really promote policies that promote good policies for all New Zealand, for all New Zealanders. We're basically sharing the same visions, whether we're standing on the left or on the right. It doesn't really matter too much. We all believe in sound economic management. Nobody wants to see high inflation. Nobody wants to see high unemployment. We basically believe in the same things, and we're trying to actually promote policies that work for the whole of the country.
Well, as you know, we're focusing much of this morning on policy and the future of the right, if you like. And I'd like to tap into your global knowledge of economically and politically of Europe. If you look at Angela Merkel, if you look at David Cameron, if you look at Nicolas Sarkozy, and to a lesser degree Silvio Berlusconi, leaders that we've always historically associated with the right, they're becoming more central, they're edging ever closer. Why are they moving away, do you think, from the traditional policies and economics of the right?
Well, I think the whole political spectrum is basically converging towards the centre. It's not just a thing that you will see on the right, you actually see it on the left as well. I think we have seen quite a bit of a conversion in the last 20 years globally. So you've got traditional left-wing parties moving closer to the centre, traditional right-wing parties moving closer to the centre, because in the end they're driven often by opinion polls, by focus groups, by short-termism, and they're really trying to just grab the issues of the day. And politics, I think, has become much less ideological after the end of the Cold War, and I think that's what we're seeing in many countries around the world, including, of course, most European countries, but I think I've seen the same in Australia, probably also New Zealand, but I've been too short in the country really to give you my decent knowledge on that.
Is that because we're moving away from fundamentalism, more towards a political realism, do you think?
Well, look, I think the old left-right dichotomy doesn't work anyway, because it is actually a concept that goes back to the French Revolution. Now, okay, nobody drives anymore in horse-drawn carriages or rides with quills and feathers, so I think we should leave that alone and we should put it to the museum, because these left-right discussions don't really get us forward anymore.
I want to touch on something that in 2009 Kevin Rudd wrote in Australia, and he argued that the global crisis was in essence the result of a failure of 30 years of neoliberalism, that it was an experiment, he said, that had failed. He's one of many who say that neoliberalism is dead. How do you sit on that?
I actually responded to Kevin Rudd at the time. I wrote a little paper for the Centre for Independent Studies on neoliberalism and where this word actually comes from. If you actually look at the history of the word neoliberalism, what it actually meant in the 1930s when it was invented was a third way, somewhere between communism, socialism and a complete free market. And I think this term neoliberalism has developed a life of its own, but I don't think it quite encapsulates what's really happening. I'm an old liberal, I'm not a neoliberal. I really believe in individual freedom, I believe in policies that work, I believe in empirical research driving policy making. I think these real stigmata, that they don't really, the stigma and dogmas don't get us any further in political debates anymore. I think we need to move beyond that.
Well, when you look at, you know, what staunchly would be a belief of the right, is that it's the role of the state and how much the state should be involved, and economic liberals would argue that they should have less involvement. But then when you look at the crisis and you look at what happened with the freeing up of financial markets and the deregulation of banks and the wild speculation that followed, it was then the state across the world that had to step in, wasn't it, and bail out these banks. It's a difficult argument to make, surely, that the state should have less of a role.
Well, you can make this argument actually if you're doing good empirical research. I just recently reviewed a book written by Vito Tanzi, who's probably one of the world's leading experts on fiscal policy. And he and his colleague Ludger Schulknecht of the European Central Bank did a lot of empirical research into government spending and found actually that beyond a certain level of government spending, you do not actually improve social results anymore. I mean, we all want to see a good healthcare system, for example. We all want to see good education. But the question is really, does the state have to spend ever more to improve the results, or is there a certain cutoff point from which extra spending actually doesn't deliver anymore? And the results that Tanzi and Schulknecht came up repeatedly in their studies was always the same. Beyond a certain level, and it's probably around the 35% of GDP mark of government spending, you do not actually improve the results. There are very little exceptions to the rule. Maybe the Scandinavian countries, but that's a special case.
So you're saying with smaller government, smaller involvement from the state, you can have that without jeopardising your social and economic goals?
Absolutely, because for some social goals that you want to reach, you don't actually need government. You can actually trust civil society to deliver these solutions themselves. And of course, a lot of government spending, if you look at most developed nations, most OECD countries, is tax churn. So people are paying into the government only to get the money back in benefits afterwards. So that doesn't really serve anyone, because whenever you get the money back from the government, first the government actually takes a bit and uses it in administration. So that is actually a waste of money. That's a dead weight lost, and I think we can do without that.
How do you think that theory would work here, though? It's a very developed welfare state.
I know, and we've seen developed welfare states in other countries as well, and how difficult it is to reform them. Unfortunately, there is a lot of pathological learning, I think, happening in many developed welfare states. It often takes a crisis, it takes a budget crisis to really consider reforms. What my role is at the New Zealand Initiative is actually to develop policies that work before you reach a crisis point, so you can actually reform in the good days when you still have some room for maneuver, rather than being forced to reforms when they're really painful and really tough to take.
Do you feel that sometimes parties lose their support, perhaps because not necessarily their economic policy, but because of their political policy?
Well, yeah, I mean, personality issues, of course, always play into things. That's something, again, that you can see in many countries around the world. In the end, when parties fail, I'm not talking about any specific parties here, of course, it comes down to personality issues. We've seen this in Europe, we've seen it in America, we've probably seen it in this part of the world as well. I think we have seen a great degree of convergence really between the major political parties. I recently read an article in a German news magazine saying that the difference really between the hard left and the hard right in Germany is 5% of income tax.
Yes,
so
Rodney Hyde mentioned as much before.
And
yes.
If you're looking at personality issues, I mean, one of the reasons now why Sarkozy will probably lose tomorrow's presidential election in France is not so much because there's so much difference between the two candidates. Actually, if you look more closely, they're quite similar. They're both lawyers. They're almost the same age. They went to the same schools and lived in the same suburb in Paris, but really because Sarkozy's personality is turning French voters off. So often politics becomes a personality contest.
I know that you're non-partisan in your role with the New Zealand Initiative, but with the knowledge of international politics and economics that you have, if you were to set an agenda for the right that would ensure a party's survival and, crucially, that they take their electorate with them, what form would that agenda take?
Well, I would never develop a platform for the right. I would develop a platform that each party can really tap into. We are going to develop policies that are open to all parties to implement. We are really driven by empirical research. We're working for policies that really work, that deliver the results that everybody wants to see, and we're happy to talk to everyone. We're happy to talk to National, to Labour, to Maori, to Winston Peters, to the Conservatives, and to ACT. It doesn't really matter. We actually want to develop parties. We're happy to talk, to develop policies, and we're happy to talk to every single political party that is willing to listen to us.
Do you think there's a need, perhaps, when you look at what's happened in Europe and even to a lesser degree in the States at the moment too, with Mitt Romney, do you think there's a need for the right to have some form of ideological overhaul, reforms at the very least? Is that how it can ensure its survival? Maybe
we should see a slight return of ideology in political debates anyway, because what I actually miss from political debates is some clear divisions. We have this convergence towards the centre ground, and what's really missing are debates, real passionate debates, really based on principles, not just on opinion polls, not just based on some focus group polling. I think the times when we actually had debates between people who believed in a more planned economy and other people who believed in a more free economy, I think they were quite healthy for democracy. When democracies converge on the centre grounds, political debates become quite stale, they become personality driven. I would actually like to have real debates on policy.
In your opinion, how does the equation work? Do good economics follow good policy, or do good politics follow good economics?
Well, unfortunately, many times it doesn't quite. I mean, there's a whole branch within economics actually explaining why that is so. Public choice economics explains why politicians often choose politics, or policies, I should say, that no economist would recommend. I mean, most economists these days, I would say probably 95% of my profession believe in free trade, and yet we still have tariffs in place that no economist would recommend. And then it is just politics that explains why we still have these remnants of a bygone age, I would say, of protectionism. And unfortunately, good politics does not always equal good economics. So again, it is the job of think tanks like us to actually promote policies that work and make them kind of feasible to politicians and easy to apply.
Right. Dr Oliver Hartwich, the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. Very much appreciate your time. Thank you.